Michael Cisco's Unlanguage is a fascinating novel and a fascinating read, and now it's one of my favorite novels. But it's also a very difficult read, not just because of its technicality, but also because of its structure and because of its intertextual narrative. Indeed, many people who would agree with me that Unlanguage is one of their favorite books also don't know quite what to say about it. So in the interest of explaining and recommending the book, I thought I would do a video about it. So in this video, I'm going to sort of pitch Michael Cisco's Unlanguage by telling you 8 things that you should be prepared to keep in mind when you read it. And then, for those of you who want some help figuring out what's going on in the book, or who need a couple of hints, I will present 10 hints to unlocking the plot of Michael Cisco's Unlanguage. Finally, after all of that, I'm going to summarize or generally spoil the book's plot structure so that if you're really having trouble understanding what's going on, you'll be able to take my general structure and use it as a map through the novel. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and let me tell you 8 things about Michael Cisco's metatextual novel, Unlanguage. First, the novel is presented as a grammar textbook. That is, the novel is presented to you as a grammar textbook, as if it were a textbook about a grammar or a language. The specific language is called Unlanguage, and it's something that you might call death speech, for reasons we'll explore in a moment. For you see, the Unlanguage, or rather Unlanguage, you're not supposed to use the article when referring to it, is an undead language. That's right, an undead language. What's that? Well, a living language is a language that people speak, and a dead language is a language that nobody uses. So an undead language must be a language that's in use but nobody speaks. Well, what kind of a language would that be? Answer: the Unlanguage is always speaking itself. Is that odd? Yes. Is it a little funny? Yes. But is it weird and fascinating and potentially horrific? Also yes. It's a Michael Cisco book. Anyway, the novel's layout, its division into units and exercises and so forth, is patterned after the layout or the format of grammar textbooks. There are lessons on declensions and cases and parts of speech and grammatical structure and syntax. And then there are weird and usually impossible exercises for the reader, some of which contain the patches of the narrative that constitute the novel's actual plot. Also, Unlanguage, that is, the topic of the textbook that this novel pretends to be, is not something that functions like an actual language. In other words, Michael Cisco didn't construct Unlanguage in the way that Tolkien constructed Elvish or something, right? Tolkien was a linguist who actually had an aim to produce a language that you could, in principle, learn or use, at least for the little bits that he put in his fiction. Cisco's not doing that. The rules for the grammar of Unlanguage are a lot more like the rules to the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. They're there, but the purpose of engaging with them is not to serve as a practical blueprint for actually doing something in your own life. Rather, there is a certain kind of whimsy about the rules, and when you engage with that whimsy, you are serving a kind of purpose. In this case, because it's also a horror novel, it's not only whimsical, but also a horrific purpose. Or rather, the purpose is to horrify. Now, in terms of the grammar lessons that constitute the units in this book, or at least in the textbook that the novel pretends to be, it's important to note that they are not gibberish. They're not nonsense, or at least not in the sense of having nothing to learn from or enjoy. They're whimsical. The lessons presuppose a basic knowledge of certain concepts in academic philosophy and in grammar. It usually doesn't deploy those concepts in a way that's straightforward. You're not usually reading a philosophy textbook or anything like it. You're usually reading something that plays with philosophical ideas, plays with grammatical ideas, and sometimes uses them more poetically than actually, literally. To give one example, in the introductory section, there's a question about how something could be labeled as atomic in a system of analysis if the label is part of the thing being labeled. To be atomic, after all, is to be indivisible, or to have only one part. So merely by labeling something as atomic, does that negate the status? Is the label of the thing part of the thing? You might think no, of course not, because you're usually applying a label, which is one type of thing, to, I don't know, an atom or a species of animal, which is another type of thing. But if you're talking about language, isn't the label the same kind of thing as the thing labeled? And so isn't there really a problem with labeling something as atomic?
That's fucking crazy, man.
There's a paragraph or two playing with this in the introduction, and the novel is full of similar musings and playful ideas about puzzles, philosophical puzzles that relate to grammar and language. And speaking of which, both the grammar lessons in Unlanguage as well as the literal parts of the story that are embedded in the exercises of the units introduce and use ideas that might not be fully explicated until later. Now, this is not an accident, and it is not meant to frustrate you as a reader. Instead, what you find is that as you read Unlanguage, you're going to be going back a few pages every now and then, sometimes back a few lessons every now and then, to revisit something that seemed weird at the time, but now you understand much more clearly. And the experience of doing that is not unlike the experience of using an actual grammar textbook. When you're using a language, you often encounter parts of speech or expressions where you understand them well enough for the context at the time, but then later on, when you are more proficient and fluent, you come back and look at them, and there's so much more to understand. As an example, in the introduction to Unlanguage, there's a man who discusses how he went full negative machine. And you wonder, what does that mean? I went full negative machine? And at the time, going full negative machine is described as some kind of psychological determination to proceed with whatever one is doing without any regard to impediments or obstacles, or something like that. But then, later, you learn in Unit 3 that when somebody tries to imagine themselves as dead, the first thing that they do is they imagine the world without them in it. And this isn't exactly right, because really to try to imagine oneself as dead, you shouldn't be imagining the world without you in it. You should realize that the very thing trying to imagine the you-less world would be absent. The conceiver, as well as the conceived, would be gone. And the realization of that philosophical idea, or at least its contemplation, is actually what constitutes negative machine. And so you learn, and I'll talk about this more when I'm starting to spoil some of the plot, that there's this mindset that the protagonist gets into that has to do with thinking about themselves as already dead, and that they're part of a whole group of people doing this, and that there's something about doing it that relates to the book's core theme and to the language that or rather the non-language, anti-language, unlanguage that the book as a novel pretends to be a textbook about. So you read the introduction, you think going full negative machine means one thing, but then you get to Unit 3, you read it for a bit, and you realize, oh, going full negative machine means something a little bit more detailed. You revisit, you gain a depth of understanding, and the novel is full of lots of this, too. I think it's a clever way to simulate the experience of actually reading and studying a grammar textbook. Now also, when it comes to the actual story in the novel, the thing that features characters and a plot structure and a narrative and settings and things like that, that story is told out of order. So not only are the bits of the novel's story embedded in these little exercises and language lessons, but they're also jumbled up and told out of order. This is on purpose. The purpose is not to frustrate you, the reader. Instead, by being arranged in the way that they are, there's something that happens to you as a reader as you go through the novel. It's kind of like a transformative experience. You suddenly realize what the plot is, and it's pretty cool. And this leads me to the book's plot, which is far from obvious at first, but which, because of its structure, gets more and more obvious as you read on. And at a certain point in the book, once the plot becomes obvious, you feel like you should probably stop reading, but it's too late because you kind of want to finish the novel. And that's a really neat effect. Now, when it comes to figuring out what's going on in this book, you might have read this book or read part of this book and wondered, what exactly is happening? What is this supposed to be about? What am I supposed to be imagining, taking away, considering? You might have been, in short, confused and not wanting the book to be spoiled, but wanting at least a few hints. So here are, of my own composition and my own thinking, Michael Cisco didn't come up with these or approve of them at all. Here are 10 clues to unlocking this novel's plot. 10 clues, in other words, to unlocking the plot of Michael Cisco's Unlanguage. Here we go. 1. Which distinct persons are mentioned at the book's opening? 2. What remarkable thing does the teacher of insuffusion do repeatedly, for which the students seem to admire and follow him? 3. Early in the book, what happens to the students of intersuffusion at the culmination of their studies? 4. What happens to our point of view character after this culmination, and to what is this miracle credited? 5. What kind of struggle takes place in the other place exactly? 6. Are the roles of teacher and student completely distinct? 7. What happens to a successful student? 8. Are the roles of author and reader completely distinct? 9. Who is supposed to have written the textbook which Cisco's novel pretends to be? 10. What must the author of a language textbook have done in order to write that textbook? Now, I think that if you just answer these questions as you are reading the novel, and then you periodically look back and you just look at the answers next to each other and think about them, you will be able to understand what's going on in Unlanguage much more easily. But take care. There are parts where you're going to be reading the novel and it's not going to be as plain as day what's going on. There's certain parts that require a little bit of interpretation or a little bit of deduction, but I promise they're rewarding. Now, without further ado, let me just spoil the general plot of Michael Cisco's Unlanguage. Let me just spoil the general plot. There are all kinds of things, both the philosophical minutiae of each lesson, as well as all kinds of symbols and metaphors that I'm just going to gloss over. I need to give you a shape of the forest before I do some big essay enumerating the trees. So I'm just going to give you the shape of the forest, that kind of general overview, outline, if you will. There are lots of things I'm just not going to get a chance to mention. The giant Cthulhu monsters, the emergence of Darrow technology, the weird symbolism of the alcohol of death, whatever that means. Yes, all those things are in there, and hey, spoilers for Michael Cisco's Unlanguage. This book is best enjoyed if you figure it out for yourself, I think. But let me break a few things down. Many of Michael Cisco's novels begin with some kind of impact or somebody being struck by something. The Divinity Student begins with a guy being hit by lightning. Ethics begins with a bird being hit by lightning. Animal Money begins with a guy talking about how he was struck by a blow on the back of the head. And The Great Lover begins with a dude being struck in the face by a paper full of philosophical gibberish and then plummeting into a sewer and dying. This is another one of those. We begin with a guy and he's running along a beach and falls and collapses onto the beach and injures his knee. As he's getting up, he says to his companion that he went full negative machine, and we think we kind of maybe know what he means at the time based on the scant explanation. And then we're off and following this character. The character isn't named. That's important. The character is part of a cult, sort of this California beach mind control cult. You know the type. They actually appear a lot in Cisco's work, like the novel Pest concerns a California beach cult. But there's this California beach cult called intersuffusion. And they're all interested in the abilities of this teacher who's supposed to be their guru or something. And this teacher has the ability to die and then come back from the dead. And he does this in front of them all the time. Whenever he dies and comes back from the dead, it's like he starts speaking this weird eldritch language and a bunch of blood pours out of his mouth and other viscous, gross bodily fluids, and then he dies. And then he just comes back. And the secret has to do with the thing that he's speaking, this weird eldritch language. So anyway, one day, after listening to this dude who spews blood out of his mouth when he speaks the Unlanguage and then dies and then comes back, all of these cultists decide that they're gonna drink a bunch of poison, and so then they spew blood out of their mouths and they all die. And then one of them comes back. And we're following that one who comes back. Now, it turns out much later, and again, the events of the story are told out of order, but when everybody died, when all those cultists died, they sort of went into this netherworld, this underworld place, this place which is just like the realm of the dead. And there, when the students were there, they were all listening to this dude who was teaching them the Unlanguage, and a bunch of blood would ooze out of his mouth along with other viscous fluids, and then they would do it, and blood would ooze out of their mouth with a lot of viscous fluids, and they're doing that stuff in the afterlife. And, well, maybe it's not an afterlife. It's weird. But in any case, our point of view character is in this under place, in this anti-world, in this neither world, and studying the Unlanguage, and they're engaged in a kind of struggle with someone over who can be the master of it. And as they progressively master the Unlanguage, they realize that the Unlanguage is something which, if you learn it while you're alive, if you master the Unlanguage while you're alive, it kills you. But if you master the Unlanguage while dead, it just brings you back to life. And so we get this idea that teacher and student together, with blood flowing out of their mouth, drank poison and died and went into the realm of death. And then there they engaged in a kind of struggle where they're learning and studying the language of non-being and vomiting up a bunch of blood and stuff. And then someone wins the struggle and comes back. Now, when that person comes back, they resume an identity of being a cultist who teaches the Unlanguage, but they are also treated as if they're increasingly, well, delusional. They are locked up in some kind of institution. And then the novel, well, I guess it's been doing this the whole time. I'm spoiling the whole thing. But it turns out that the Unlanguage, the textbook that this novel pretends to be, was actually authored by you, the reader. Or you're somehow responsible for learning it and then mastering it and having the book be there. Basically, the idea is this, that there are two modes of play going on in Unlanguage. On one hand, there's the play between the identity of teacher and student. Here's the question. Who really came back? We're told that a teacher died and a student died, a student of the Unlanguage and a teacher of the Unlanguage. Then in the netherworld, there's some struggle between teacher and student, okay? And then someone comes back. By the time they come back, they're a teacher, but don't students become teachers too? So who was it who really died and came back? Who is the real point of view character? And then while that's happening, while the identities of teacher and student in the third person are being blurred in the narrative, there's another blurring of identity between the author of the textbook that the novel pretends to be and the reader. There are increasing implications that you are not just the reader of this book, but that you're also somehow the author of it. But check this out. If in the course of reading this book, the line between teacher and student is blurred, and the line between author and reader is blurred, and if this is indeed a language textbook that could only be written by someone who mastered the language, guess what? That means you necessarily will master Unlanguage. Or at least you will by the time you finish the book. But wait a minute, what does Unlanguage do when someone living masters it? It kills them. So does that mean that this book is killing you as you read it? Yes! Yes, it is. That's what's so freaking cool about this, or it's one of 1,000 things that's so freaking cool about this, is that this book is really this book. This is, by the way, one of my favorite books when I was a little kid. The monster at the end of this book, starring Grover, is an interactive meta text featuring Sesame Street characters, where you, the reader, are warned. You are warned as you begin to read this that you better stop reading. Reading is dangerous. If you keep reading, not only will something bad happen to you, but also you will be tasked with defying the earnest efforts of someone who's trying to stop you from reading it. Someone in the book. And that's what's happening here too. You are learning the Unlanguage as you read Michael Cisco's Unlanguage. And as you learn Unlanguage, you are coming closer and closer to mastering it, which is coming closer and closer to dying. The story that's embedded in the unit exercises is a kind of warning. It's trying to warn you, hey, people who learn this die, and dead people who learn this come back to life, and that's not a good trip either. Stop what you're doing before it kills you. But here's the thing also. At the end of the monster, at the end of this book, it turns out that the horrible thing that was being warned of is there, but it's also kind of funny. It's horrible, yeah, but it's also funny. Grover is a horrible monster, but he's also funny. And what happens at the end of this book? It's horrible, yes, but it's also very, very funny. It's a two-sentence pun, it's a two-word pun that, or a two-word sentence that constitutes a pun that is perfect for this idea of dying being the process of learning this language, of studying a textbook. It's very clever. I'm not going to spoil it. You can easily spoil it yourself just by getting the book and then reading the last sentence, although I wouldn't go about it that way. But Michael Cisco's Unlanguage is like Pokemon evolution or something of the monster at the end of this book starring Grover. It's amazing. I love it. Now, on to the significance of this book. There's a lot of ways you could go. This is one of the things that I really like about weird fiction as opposed to a lot of, more straightforward modernist fiction that you find in like James Joyce or whatever, where, there's kind of an intended metaphor or allegory that you pick up. One of the things that this book reminded me of, and people do refer to Cisco as like the modern Kafka, but if you've read Kafka's story In the Penal Colony, you know that story concerns a kind of gruesome execution device. The execution device slowly kills whoever is applied to it, whoever is strapped into it. It slowly kills them in a painful way. But the way that it kills them is that it slowly etches into their flesh over and over again. It scours into them the message which explains why they died. Basically, their sentencing or their sort of verdict, their verdict on life. Why do they deserve to die? The answer is told to them excruciatingly as they're being executed, being seared into their flesh. It's just that they never understand until the very end, until a split second before their death actually occurs, and by that time, they can't actually communicate it. So they get this flash of enlightenment just before death, and then at that moment, it's too late to communicate the enlightenment. They figured it all out, but oops. And there's something both tragic and comedic about that, something that you might say is quintessentially Kafkaesque. And I think also there's something like that going on in Cisco's Unlanguage. I think that, when you're reading this novel and you realize that you're learning a fictional language whose mastery constitutes death, at least if you're alive, and whose mastery constitutes coming to life if you're dead, well, then it's sort of like this weird, it's a similar process. You come all the way up to the point where you realize what's being written, and then it's too late. And that's pretty cool. I'm not sure if that was the intent. In fact, I would really like to pick Michael Cisco's brain about other metaphors, allegories, messages he had for this book. And I also want to know what you, the viewers, think of Michael Cisco's Unlanguage. Did you watch this whole video? If you did you read Michael Cisco's Unlanguage? Did you figure something out for yourself that was different from what I think I have figured out? Let me know in the comments. Thanks very much. Don't forget to do all the internet things. Click like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell icon if you want notifications on further videos on this channel. There are more coming soon, including Ravenloft videos, I promise. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and thanks.